Okay, so the last set of examples we're going to look at is going to entail us interpreting graphs. So directions here say to use the graphs of y is equal to f of x and y is equal to g of x to evaluate the given functions. Okay, so the graph of y is equal to f of x is drawn to the left, and the graph of y is equal to g of x is drawn to the right. You're going to want to pause the video until you get those graphs drawn, and then we'll take a look at the various examples that we're going to look at. Okay, so for number one, when we look at number one, we're asked to find g inverse of 0, which, like, we're not given the graph of g inverse. And I don't want to have to take the time to draw the graph of g inverse. So we're going to take a look at how we can use the graph of g to help us find information regarding the graph of g inverse. Okay, so if we want to calculate g inverse of 0, that means that on the graph of g inverse, 0 is our input. We want to calculate what the output is going to be. But again, we're not given the graph of g inverse. We're given the graph of g instead. So if I'm going from the graph of g inverse to the graph of g, we know we have to switch the x and y coordinates of every ordered pair. So on the graph of g, I'm looking for the input that gives me an output of 0. Okay, so when I look at the graph of g, what x coordinate gives me a y coordinate of 0? And that's the x coordinate -2. Which means that on the graph of g inverse, when I switch the x and y coordinates back, that means that g inverse of 0 is -2. Okay, so that's much more efficient than having to use the graph of g and then try to sketch the graph of g inverse to evaluate functions on that graph. Okay, let's take a look at number 2. So for number 2, we have g composed with f of -4. So the first thing we have to calculate here, if we have a composite function, is f's value at -4. So I go to the graph of f. At -4, the y coordinate is going to be equal to 4. So this is asking us to find g of 4. And then if we want to calculate g's value at 4, we go to the graph of g, and the x coordinate at that point, when we go to the y value, at that x value, so the y coordinate at x is equal to 4 is going to be 6. Okay, so that composition there is going to be equal to 6. Okay, for number 3, if we want to calculate g inverse composed with f of 3, that is like asking us to find g inverse of f of 3. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is we want to evaluate the inner function, f of 3. So f of 3, we go to the graph of f. The y coordinate when x is equal to 3 is -4. So this is like asking us to find g inverse of -4. Okay, so if I want to calculate that, the input for g inverse is -4. We want to find the output for that function, which means I'm going to go to the graph of g, and I'm looking for the x value that gives me a y value of -4. So when I look at the graph of g, my y coordinate is -4 when the x coordinate is -5. So that composition there is going to be equal to -5. Okay, number 4, F inverse composed with G inverse of -2. So this is asking us to find F inverse of G inverse of -2. So we want to do the inner function in the composition first. We want to calculate G inverse of -2. So on the graph of G inverse, my input is -2. We want to figure out what the output is. So I go to the graph of G. I'm looking for the x coordinate. That gives me a y coordinate of -2. Okay, so the y value is -2 when the x value is -3. So that's going to be -3, which makes G inverse of -2 -3. So this is asking us to calculate F inverse of -3. So if we want to find F inverse of -3, -3 is my input for that function. We want to find the output, which means we want to go to the graph of F and figure out what is the x value that makes the y value -3. So our y value is -3 when the x value is 1. So that makes F inverse of -3 equal to 1. Okay, so that is how we evaluate inverse functions based on the graph of the original function. I think that's the most efficient, easiest way to work through problems of that type. And again, good chance you're going to see something like that. And definitely the example before, those are good test level questions for sure. Okay, so that's it. That wraps up this lesson. Again, make sure you guys start working on the review for your Chapter 1 test, and we'll see you next week. Take care.